All right, how's it going, everyone? My name is Sam Welker, and this is Cosmic Sandbox. And today I'm going to be taking you through my process of creating this hair simulation. Let's actually hit play so you can watch it. This hair simulation that I've created in Houdini, and then I have pulled it into Maya and rendered it in Arnold. Now, I had a lot of trouble figuring out how to get hair from a groom, like a simulated groom in Houdini, into Maya, and I spent the better half of 2 days Googling it, trying to figure it out because Maya just kept on crashing and doing all sorts of things. So I figured maybe I could help people not suffer the way I did. So hopefully this helps you. Now, I'm sure there are other ways to do this. There's potentially better ways to do this, but this is the way that I figured out how to get my groom and simulation from Houdini into Maya for rendering with Arnold. So, some notable things to mention up front. First of all, this groom is just something I whipped together for this tutorial, so it's not very finalized. Like, you'll see some like random hair right here that just sits there and doesn't really go well with the part, and maybe that's more realistic. I don't know, but there's also not enough subdivisions on the hairs, and there's a little bit of like flickering in here in certain spots, like right here. But I think if you're pixel peeping, then you'll find stuff like that. But overall, I think it's a pretty fantastic simulation for what it's worth. And also, another notable fact is all of this simulation, all the grooming, all the coloring included, were all done in Houdini. I basically colored all the curves in Houdini. I wanted something a little bit more stylized and something more instead of something more physically accurate. So if I wanted more physical accuracy, it would be better to do a lot of the coloring in the actual shaders in Arnold using the melanin sliders. But I actually kind of skipped that. Now I know that's not very realistic, but it does look good and it covers the needs. And yeah, I think it was pretty good. So I want to basically pull you through my scene files. And if you are interested in learning a little bit more about any of this process that I don't cover here, please let me know in the comments below. I would be happy to expand on this further. I actually had a really good time doing this and enjoyed it quite a bit. And it was a really smooth process. So, I'd love to show you more. So, anyways, this is my Houdini scene, and over here you can see my Maya scene. These are two separate monitors I'm going to be switching between for the sole fact that pulling Maya into here is the UI just gets too small, and it's just not how I'm set up to work. So, anyways, here's our Houdini scene, and we have the skin object here. Let me hide others. And what I've got is this quote skin object with a couple of attributes painted onto it. Some of them I'm using, some of them I'm not, but it just gave me some stuff to work with. I created a groom with it, pulled it in and simulated it, and I'll show you how I did that a little bit. And then I took that and I pulled that into an object merge, and I had a group node that I never used. And then I put it into an out null just in case, and then I put it into an alembic and I exported it. So that's 120 frames, and you can see the alembic is loaded in here. So if we go in and look at the actual hair simulation itself, let's let it load. It's going to take just a moment. If I middle mouse click and hold, you can see that there are 225,000 points, and there are, or excuse me, polygons. There's 225,000 primitives, but there's also 10 points per hair. So there are 2.25 million points. Now, in a cached simulation, that's a lot. This is something like a 3 gigabyte file, and if you're loading this all into the GPU, it could be a little bit intense. So, for rendering and things like that, and I did render on Arnold's GPU rendering. But it worked out pretty well for my actual needs, but it's a pretty large file, and that's where I was running into most of my issues. So if we switch over to Maya, you can see that I've got Maya in here, and what you can't see is the hair is already loaded. It's right here. I've pulled in the skin alembic, which I exported as well, just to make sure that the position was in the right space from Houdini, which you can see over here. And then I pulled in the groom simulation. I'll show you how I did that. So I wrote the alembic in Houdini to disk, and then in Maya, you go to cache, GPU cache, import. And let me pull this over. And it is, let me actually pull that back. All right, now we are in our directory. Okay, so this is where the Maya project is, and the scene file is saved in here. The alembics are in here. I've got the simulation in the sphere. This is the simulation file for it. And this file is pretty large. It's 3 gigabytes, as you can see right here. So we just go ahead and click import, and that's it. Now it's in Maya. And if you go to the attribute editor, you can see if you scroll down, you've got some Arnold settings in here if you need to actually tweak any of these, but everything came in just fine for me. I did need to tweak the material, the shader, but that ended up being just fine. So that is exactly how I loaded in the geometry. I know that's fairly simple, but sometimes it's just knowing what buttons to press. So let's go ahead and look at the shader itself. Also, if you select the hair in the outliner and then right click and hold, you can assign the material down with the existing materials down here, and that's how I assigned the material as well. So let's open up the Hypershade, and I'll show you how I built the material. It's incredibly simple. But what I did was I just turned off the base color, and I ended up going with the diffuse color. And the diffuse color just uses the color, as you can see, from the hair simulation in Houdini. Now, I'll break down how I did all of that a little bit more after we get through the basics here. But let's go back to Maya. So what I did was I just turned diffuse up to 100%, or just to 1. By default, it's at 0 and base is at 1. But I just turned that all down, turned this up, and left the roughness as is. And then I used an AI user data color, and I used the CD node or attribute, which is from Houdini. If we middle mouse click on this hair again, you can see CD is a point attribute, which stands for color in Houdini. I don't know what the D is for, but that's what it is. So back over here, you can see that attribute just pulled over just fine. I know that color is relatively close to the hair color that we rendered, but earlier when I was doing tests, I had it as pink. So, that helped me to know that the simulation was working. So anyways, that's how it works. And then I just set up my render settings and wrote it to disk and hit render. And again, I used the GPU renderer. I have 2 GPUs in my system, and one of them is for monitors. One of them is for monitors and simulation. So I had to tell Arnold to only use one of them. And I tried motion blur. It was not having it. So I'll explore that more later on the projects I'm doing currently with grooming. But anyways, that is how I rendered hair in Houdini, or from Houdini in Maya. There was a massive headache trying to pull in alembic caches as references or just as alembics, because even with a single frame 20 megabyte file, for some reason, my RAM, which by the way, my computer is not like the strongest, but it's not weak. My computer was, basically filling up all of its RAM quite quickly. And I run at, I have a lot running right now, but I have 32 gigs of RAM. And Maya would quickly just take all of that RAM and just, like, as you can see, even just as is, it just hogged all the RAM. So as I would import those alembics, Maya would just stop working. So the GPU cache was the only thing I could get to work, but it worked really well. And I did have some issues with, being able to see it, not being able to see it was potentially a risk, but I think it worked out well for the actual render, and I could see it well enough in Houdini to know. So let's go ahead and actually break down a little bit further the scenes that I have. So while we're in Maya, I'll go ahead and switch out of my camera and into my perspective view, and I'll show you the lighting setup I have, because I know some people find this interesting. So this is the lighting. This is, there are 5 lights in here, and if we actually go into the Arnold, I think it's Utilities Light Editor. Yep, okay, that opened up on the other window, and let's go ahead and open up the render view. And I'm going to go ahead and actually switch to the other monitor for this. This is the motion blur version, by the way. This is what I was talking about. It just didn't work. So let's go ahead and look at one light at a time. So you can see, if I turn off all the lights, you can see this is the blue fill shape that I have. Let's look at the next one. There's blue rim, an orange key light, and an overall white front kind of overhead softbox. And then I have a bright white rim as well that actually ended up being less of a rim and more of just a general fill. Oh, excuse me. Nope, that is not soloed. Sorry. That's the rim. Okay. My apologies, that was not correct. Okay, so anyways, that's the lighting setup I had, and if you want to see the settings on these, these are the intensities. Most of the exposures were balanced around 8, and then the blue fill here, which I'm soloing now, which you can see right there, was set to an exposure of 5. So that is how I set that up. And if you aren't familiar with Zoo tools, they are amazing. And I used the place reflection tool. I don't know if this is built into Maya or not. And to be honest, it probably could be. Oh, it looks like this actually is a tool from Brave Rabbit. But yeah, basically I would select the actual light and then click place reflection, and then I'd click on the sphere and it would just place the lights based on where I wanted them. And that was really helpful. And if you don't know what Zoo Tools is, check it out. It's absolutely a game saver. Like, it's so good. So let's wait for Maya to pull this in. It's a little bit too large right now. So we'll go back to the light editor real quick to turn all these back on in case we want to have them available later. All right, so yeah, so that is our render, and it is inside of Maya. And you can't see it animating in the viewport, but you can in Houdini. But it does, in fact, animate. I don't know what I was trying to say. But yeah, it does animate in Maya. It does work. And as you can see, based on the actual renders itself, let's take a peek at that again. This is the viewport versus the nuke export. It's pretty faithful. So let's take a peek at how we actually built this in Houdini. So this was fun. Now I'm going to show you what tool I used. This is the grooming tool I used. I have spent a decent bit of time lately looking at different tools out there. For grooming, I've used the default tools built into Houdini. I've used XGen. Never again, that was terrible. XGen is highly unreliable, and it crashes like none other. So I don't recommend using XGen if you can avoid it. I don't want to spend a bunch of money for this project on Yeti or Nadix, and shaving a haircut hasn't been supported in a while, so I ended up not looking at any of those. But what I did do was I found Groombear as a toolkit for working in Houdini, and Houdini's, in my opinion, a very usable, easy to use system once you understand it. If you're not trying to do like the really deep technical stuff, it's actually fairly simple. And this just is the most artist-friendly approach I have used yet, which is ironic because it's in Houdini, which is not thought of as a very artist-friendly system. But Groombear is an insanely useful system, and for the price, this is, in my opinion, this is highly underpriced for what it brings to the table. It's incredible. And you can watch their video to see more about it. Now, if this thumbnail is weirding you out, don't worry, it weirded me out too. Turns out those are actually feathers on a gorilla, just as a technical demonstration, but this stuff is insanely good, and that's using the Houdini grooming system as well. So it does benefit from Houdini's amazing grooming tools, but the actual guide placement tools are a little lackluster compared to Groombear, so I did end up using that. So again, here's the sphere that I decided to put this on, and let's go ahead and take a peek at the actual groom. So this is the groom that I have here. So when you create a groom using the shelf tools, which are the hair tools up here, I just clicked add fur, and then inside I get the guides up here, and then the guides, skin, and VDB exports, and then using the Groombear C menu over here, you can just hit C and go to base options, tools, and then groom, and it'll actually set it up for you, and you can just have it link up everything, or you can just manually link it up. The guides go in the first first input, skin in the second, skin VDB in the third, and so forth. And then basically I took that and I created this really simple haircut here, and just drew a bunch of guides in where I wanted them. I used the scatter tool to scatter in and fill in the actual nodes a bit more. You actually can, let's see, hopefully won't crash. There we go. Okay. Yeah. So you can see that you can, let's ghost other objects. Actually, let's just show all. Okay. Let me turn off the hair gen. Oh, that turned on the hair gen. Excuse me. Hold on. Just one moment. I apologize for the delay. All right, so this is what the hair looks like from Houdini's viewpoint. This is like actually shaded. Let's go back. There we go. Okay. So I basically can use the scatter tool to just draw on and fill in more points here. And I can either scatter with the initial brush and just do one extra point, or I can just use a paintbrush and it'll just kind of follow the approximation of the other guides. So it's really fast and easy to just get a bunch of like general shape in and then just fill it in. Now, I wasn't super thrilled with the transition of long hair on top and then really short hair on the side. I didn't think it looked as good as a blended look would have looked, but it worked out. So and then I used a rest node out of that and a guide partition. Basically, the shelf tool for part guides is basically what I used. What you do is you just select this, drop it into a guide partition, and the guide partition can allow you to draw a parting line. And if we look at that actual parting line, let's see, for some reason it's not easy to see right now, but let's see if I can make it more visible. There you go. This is the parting line that I drew. I basically made sure I could see the sphere and everything, and I just drew a line right between the guides. And then I used that to create a guide partition, and that helps Houdini to know that the hair needs to go two separate sides. And then I used an expression to grab all the roots. This is a drop down right here in the group expressions. You just click this little drop down and it is first point of primitive. Now you already have a root guide coming out of this naturally, but I just created my own just in case. And then I dropped it into a vellum hair simulation and vellum solver. And in the vellum hair simulation, I put my root points group as the root points, and then I upped the stiffness on stretch and bend, and that was it. And then in the vellum solver, if we drop in, you can see that I used a pop wind force with a -2, -0.5, and 1 in the amplitude. And that's all I changed. Very simple. And that gave me the vellum simulation for the hair. And I thought it looked really nice. Very similar to, oh gosh, I can't remember his name off the top of my head. I apologize for this. But it's Houdini time videos. They're great if you haven't seen them. Oh man, I'm gonna feel really bad for not remembering his name. But yeah, the guy that made the tutorial on doing vellum hair just did that basic, setup just like that. So I just followed that exact same process, and it worked out really well for the hair simulation. I thought it looked really good. So again, this could use more love and more tweaks, and there's some loose hair here that looks kind of messy. Be nice at the crown to use the swirl brush from Groom Bear, but I didn't end up doing that. So again, could have pushed it a little further with that. Let's go ahead and go up and go into the hair gen itself. And this is the hair generation, and I'm going to show you how I got to getting the hair to look like this. So when you pull the hair in, let's go ahead and create a null. I'm going to show you what it looks like. So let me see. Can I just, yeah, okay, good layout. All right, so this is the hair that I get when it comes in, right? So it is very basic. Let's actually look at the skin hair gen settings as well. I have 150,000 in my density, and then I changed my influence radius. I turned it down, and I set the maximum guide count to be lower. I also used a density attribute from the skin that I'll show you. So when you have your density, if you set this to no overrides, it'll just give you these like circular, influences around the guides, and I just find that to be very unnatural. So instead I used a skin attribute, and you can see it looks a lot better there. It's still kind of circular, but I used the density attribute to kind of loosen it up a bit. And I'll show you again how I made that in the skin in a minute. And then I basically took that, and this is what you get out of it. This is what it actually looks like. So this is the hair that comes out of it. It's very dense. It doesn't look very good, and it's not shaded in this particular scenario. So it's kind of hard to see. Let me show all so you can see it with the sphere in it. Might give a little bit better context. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's a better way to view this. I think just different angles, but you can kind of tell, what's going on here. And let's go ahead and take a peek at how I set that up. So first of all, the density element was really easy to do. Basically just took an attribute paint, and let's hide the other objects. Let's just take a peek at this. There you go. So I just painted on this right here using the attribute paint. I guess I left a little spot off here, but that's fine. And then I used the shift key while painting to smooth it out. And then I took that, and I forgot to actually set the name of that. And instead of just changing the name in here, I, for some reason, just used an attribute copy and just copied it from mask to density and just created a new attribute from that. And then I did another paint, and this was for the part. I was going to use this for the part, but I ended up not. I realized that using the guide partition node was the way to go. So that is how I created that. And then the last thing I did was I created an attribute clump, a clump attribute paint. And I did end up using something different in the end, but this is what I initially used for some clumping. And this is a skin attribute, and it outputs on the skin that I was able to then use in the actual hair generation over here. Again, this didn't actually get used in some cases, but if you look at the actual clump here, actually, never mind, it did. I used the skin attribute to drive my clump nodes, and it was really useful. So anyways, let's look at how I actually clumped the hair. So if you look at this hair, it looks really flat, and like I had mentioned, it looks kind of like it has kind of a hard cutoff, and I think I recover it fairly well in the clumping and the layout, but you can see it's kind of like short hair and then like this long hair that just ends, and it just kind of looks like a bowl cut. It's not very clean. So let's turn off the grid and add the sphere back in. But let's go ahead and start by, let's do this. Let's actually go to the output hairs, and then we're just going to disable these nodes and go one by one. And then I'm going to go ahead and yeah, that's not worth it. Okay. We'll just use a color node, which is fine. Okay, so this is how the hair looks when it comes in. Again, not perfect, and some of the partition here didn't come off so well. You can see how it just kind of goes back and forth. It's a little messy. Some of the part doesn't look very good there. It just got a little too close. So let's take a peek at what we actually said, or what we did to set this up to make it look a little bit better. So first thing I did was I set up the hair clumps. Now I'm going to create another color node to just kind of bring down with me and take the guides and push them into it. And we're going to use a random from attribute, and then I called this Clump Id1. And at least I think I did. Yeah, I did. Okay. Oh, you know what? This needs to be set to primitive. Okay. And then I need to delete the original colors. Okay, so this is the hair clumps that I get from my initial clumping. Now, this actually could have been even smaller. Normally, it's best to start with a very, very small clump. I find, at least, it really depends on what you're going for in the style. But I find that generally, if you're doing a shorter set of hair or fur or something like that, doing some really small clumps first and working smaller to bigger tends to look pretty good. So you can do that the inverted way, but it depends on what style you're going for. I find it to look more realistic if I start with the smaller clumps first. So the next thing we're going to do is pass in to the second clump, and you can see we still have Clump Id1. You can see the shape change. Let's look at that. And I'll go through the actual settings in a moment. But the Clump Id1 is still the shading for the first clump. And then if we go to 2, you can see the second set of clumps. And then again, big surprise with Clump Id3. And again, you can see it change again, but we still have Clump Id2 and 1 visible here. So you can see what they look like with that variation. Let's look at 3. These are the chunks of hair that are clumping together. And I find that this is more natural for how this type of hair seems to form together. So let's go ahead and take a peek at Clump Id1 and just look at these and see how they vary. So the first thing is the clump itself is driven by this blend here, and then the size of the clump is the radius at how far it looks to create a clump. Crossover rate is basically how much can it steal from its neighbors and have a more natural blend. Otherwise, you get some really unnatural clumping together where it's just kind of like all spotty and it's weird. Stray rate also lets you have a couple of random hairs poke out, which again is more natural. And then I used curling very minimally with the skin attribute of clump that we looked at earlier. And I wanted it to only clump on the top, or excuse me, curl. So if we turn on and off curling, you can see very subtly it, actually that's actually a lot more than subtle. That actually changes it quite a bit. It's a very small amount, but you can see it's quite a dramatic change. And that's something I used on all of the different clump nodes, and it just kind of gave it a lot more realism. So we move on to the next clump and the next clump node, and we have the exact same type of setup with just different numbers. And then I also used fractal clumping here. So if we set this to 1, you can see it's a variation on, the clumping itself. I think what this does is it basically will adjust the clump scale. And the clumps just make them look a little bit more natural based on fractals. That's my assumption. I could be totally wrong, but that's what I'm using it for. So again, if I'm wrong, maybe check the documentation, see if that is what it is doing for you, but that's what I use that for. So this is Clump ID2, and let's again take a peek at what it looks like with and without the curling. So the curling just kind of, creates some individual hair strands. Let's go back to this. You can see one thing that really just comes across well is just like a really natural set of, it almost looks like fur almost. These chunks of clumps over here, and these little like chunks of hair just, if you're looking at like animal fur or something like that, this is, kind of how you could approach that. And I think it's also a fairly common approach for human hair styles. It just looks good to have that breakup. So the next thing we're going to do is check out hair clump 3, and this is clump ID 3. And again, let's make sure curling is on. There we go. And then curling again, just adding more breakup and variation. And I don't think I changed the frequency on any of these. No, I didn't. But the frequency is just how much curl it does. Like if you want a lot of curl, just more curling, more intense breakup frequency. Going higher just adds more breakup. So we'll just leave it at the default. And then again, fractal clumping, and again, just a larger clump size and a blend, again, using the skin attribute of clump, and then a crossover rate and a stray rate. And I had thought I actually used Groom Bear in here to paint on these, but that was actually on a completely separate scene and render. So anyways, let's go ahead and continue on. I'm going to go back to Clump ID1 for previews. And let's go ahead and actually, let's just disable this. No, let's keep it enabled. Maybe we'll try looking at Clump ID 2 or 3. So what I did here is I kind of trimmed out the hair. Let's just have a broader view with Clump ID 3. So notice the length of all of the hairs, and then I basically use this to thin it out a bit. So I used this set length node, or the set length operation in the guide process node. So you just type in length, and its guide process is set length, and that's how you get to the node. Same thing with Frizz. That's how I snagged all that. But basically, I used the guide process, and instead of setting the length with set, I used it to multiply. And I just took the actual length and I set, it comes in like so, and you just click randomize, and I set the minimum scale factor to 0.5, and it basically just kind of, the hair kind of trims down, and any strand of hair has the, ability to end up between half its length and its current length. And I'm using the cut or extend, not the scale method. If we use scale, you can see it's just scaling the actual strands, and that looks weird. It just creates kind of a messy cluster. But when you use cut or extend, it actually takes the length of the strand and it goes along that and trims it down, and it's really helpful. The next thing I did was I used Frizz, and Frizz just breaks it up a little bit more. Again, just like all the curling and everything, and just, frizzy hair, it just hair frizzes. And just adding a very subtle amount of this with these settings here gave me a very nice clean frizz. And basically with and without, it's very, very subtle, but that is what I did. And then I took the Clump ID attributes and I promoted them. So using the promote attribute, what I was able to do was take these clumps and I did Clump ID 2 or 1, 2, and 3. And I basically used the attribute promote node to take them from a primitive attribute to turn them into a point attribute. And then what I was able to do there is work some really fun magic and color my hair. This is the attribute VOP node, and I basically created a ramp to take a grayscale input based on these randoms here, which I'll show you, or based on the IDs of these clumps. And what I did was I pulled it into the attribute VOP, and I'm not even honestly sure in the end if I needed these to be point attributes, but it ended up working, so I left it as is. But this is a point system. The attribute VOP is working on points. And then what I did was I jumped in and I created a bind node. That's the first thing I did. So I took the bind, and let's actually just go ahead and pull this in, and I'll show you the actual process of, or I'll show you the actual breakdown, but I'll just start with the process of how I did this. So the bind went into a random node. And then basically this is super cool. What you can do with this is it's kind of like the color node where you have a random from attribute. Let's just plug this in. So this random attribute will give me a, based on my input, I don't have a parameter set here yet, so let's change that, Clump Id1. So now we have this 1D input, which is the integer, and 1D output, which is a one-dimensional output, not a, it's a float output. So instead of it being a vector 3, in other words, something like a color, which is, you know, RG and B, instead it just has basically just the brightness in the 1D output. So that's what I ended up using, but you can use the 3D color if you want to just have a variety of color. And then what you can do is you can just, you know, use a color mix node. And let's say we want the hair color to be something a little bit more desaturated brown. And then I want to have mostly this color here. And then you can just use that to, that's not very bright. I'd like that to be brighter. Okay, this doesn't look very good, but this is the principle. I've used this a lot with particles, but you can take that randomness and then you can use the color mix with it and then just kind of pull in some, you know, variation in hue and saturation. And you can also add a color correct node after the random to tweak it a bit. But anyways, what I ended up using was the 1D output, and this looks super clean. And then I was able to use another bind node as well. And what was that called? It's tightness. So this is something you get out of using the clump nodes. You don't just get this, but if you're using the clump nodes, which we are, up here, all three of these, you get these attributes out of it, and tightness is one of them. So this last tightness is the one we're using. So it basically uses the, you know, because of how Houdini works, we have the tightness attribute from this one, and this one. In the end, it's just using the most recent one. I don't think it stacks. I think it just overwrites it. So what we're using is that tightness attribute, and also the bind attribute, or the clump ID attribute, and I'm taking those and then I'm mixing them together and creating something like this. So let's go ahead and take the bind attributes of the different clumps, and I'll show you when the tightness comes in. Let's do this. So let's pull this over. So this is again the same thing we just saw. This is the clumps, the Clump Id1, and then let's look at Clump Id2. And then let's look at them mixed together. I'm gonna go ahead and close this. Sorry, that's a lot of real estate. Probably would have been nice to have. I keep that open because it's nice to have two open, but yeah, so if we look at this, if we mix this and if we disable it, you can see the variation. It's very subtle. I wanted to primarily focus on the variation of color on the single or the small clumps for more individual strands. And then I did the same thing with the larger clumps as well, where I pulled all this in and then had a small amount, just a 20% involvement of the larger clumps. And basically, it gave us this really nice variation right here. And then we multiplied that with the tightness attribute, and that just gave us darker roots, which is just a really popular style. Like if you've ever seen somebody with blonde dyed hair, they have darker roots, and it just tends to look good. In fact, actually, even just with sun bleaching, it ends up looking that way as well. So even if you don't dye your hair, a lot of different hairstyles will have the roots just be darker because they just get less sunlight and they keep more melanin. And I think that's how that works. I actually don't understand the science of that particularly, but basically what happens is the roots just maintain a darker look, and it just creates a nice contrast and separation, and you get this nice look. So I took that, and then I pushed that into this ramp. And then in the ramp, I also did a little bit of color correction. Let's pull that in. So the color correction is just a variation, and this gives a little bit more of a darker maroon look. This is more of like a orangey blonde look. And then I used the mix node with the factor being, I think it was just this guy right here, the initial Clump ID random. Does seem to be the case. Yeah, that's the case. Okay. So that ended up driving the mix between these two. So basically the difference is just the hair looked like, well, that's actually a really bad sample. But let's turn off the mix node. So this is just the variation of what it looked like, between the color correction and then adding back in the original hair color, and it gave a really nice blend. And I love using this method to create variation in the hair. So this is how I prefer to work when I'm working with grooming. You can do a lot more in shaders in some areas, and you can do a lot of really cool magic with different things, but what I ended up doing was using this method, and it stores it as a point attribute, which can end up bloating the file size. But for something, even something with a couple million hairs, it doesn't tend to be too much. So it doesn't affect the simulation itself. And I was able to just export that as an Alembic file, and this is what the hair looked like as strands without shading. And yeah, so that's basically, I think, just about everything that I did. Let me think if there was anything else. Nope, I think that's gonna pretty much cover it. So we'll go back to Houdini. I created a different camera. I guess that's one thing I did. But yeah, I just set up the lighting, and again, let's take a look at the actual Hypershade and look at the material. Just referring to, this is the color attribute that you got out of that hair in Houdini right here, using the CD attribute. Again, just pulling that in through the Alembic in Maya. Luckily, it just understands it. I'm used to working in Cinema 4D, and in the past, I don't think it was able to do stuff like that. I'm not actually quite sure. I haven't used the newer versions of Cinema 4D as much lately. But yeah, basically just pulling that into the diffuse color like we talked about earlier, and pulling that into the standard hair surface material. So just using that to set the surface shader. So very simple. And if you guys have any other questions, let me know, and I will be happy to answer them. And again, let's just take a peek at what that simulation and render looked like. Again, it wasn't perfect. It does have issues. I think the groom guides are just a little bit too close and overlapping with the center. But I think it was a really good setup and a really good start, and I think it covered some really good points. So this is something I've been working on a lot lately for my needs, and these are some of the issues I ran into, and hopefully they answered your questions. So thank you so much for your time, and have a fantastic day, guys. I will see you in the next one.